At exactly 8:17 p.m., the checkout screen flashed one final number, $27.43, still due. Without looking Cheryl Murphy in the eyes, the store manager began removing groceries from her cart, one by one. Bread, eggs, milk. Then the small box of strawberries her 8-year-old daughter Emma had carried through the entire store with both hands. "It's okay, Mommy," Emma whispered, placing it back herself. The shoppers behind them sighed impatiently. One even raised a phone to record. Only one man remained silent. Dressed in an old brown jacket, he watched Cheryl carefully return every unwanted item to its proper shelf, before quietly walking away with her nearly empty cart. No one recognized the billionaire who had just witnessed the most important lesson of his life. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. We'd love to see how far this story travels. And if stories about kindness, dignity, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next journey. The alarm on Cheryl Murphy's phone vibrated at exactly 4:45 every morning. It hadn't played a cheerful melody in years. Just a soft buzz, gentle enough not to wake Emma sleeping in the next room, but persistent enough to remind Cheryl that another day had already begun before the sun had even considered rising. She reached for the phone without opening her eyes. For 10 seconds, she allowed herself to stay perfectly still. Those 10 seconds were a luxury she could still afford. Outside the apartment window, Columbus was wrapped in darkness. Streetlights reflected off damp pavement after an overnight drizzle, and the old heating unit rattled against the bedroom wall with its familiar metallic cough. Cheryl had reported the noise to the landlord 3 winters in a row. 3 winters later, the heater still sounded like it was arguing with itself. She smiled anyway. "If it still makes noise," she whispered to herself, "it still works." It was something her father used to say whenever the family car threatened to fall apart. She missed him most in moments like these. Her apartment wasn't much more than 600 square feet, tucked above an aging laundromat on the east side of the city. The carpet had faded into a color no one could accurately name anymore. The kitchen cabinets refused to close unless pushed twice. The bathroom faucet dripped with perfect rhythm, as if measuring time more faithfully than any clock. But every corner was spotless. Not because Cheryl had extra time, because order was the only thing poverty couldn't take away from her. She brewed a single cup of coffee, measuring exactly 1 spoonful of grounds. Never more. Coffee had become expensive enough that every scoop mattered. While the kettle heated, she opened a small blue notebook whose cover had begun peeling at the edges. Every page contained columns of careful handwriting: rent, electricity, bus pass, asthma medication, school lunch, gas, groceries, income. Every dollar had a destination before it arrived. She crossed out yesterday's sewing payment, $20. A pair of work pants shortened for an elderly neighbor. The money was folded neatly inside an envelope tucked into the notebook. Not spending cash. Emergency cash. There was a difference. At exactly 5:15, Cheryl quietly opened Emma's bedroom door. The little girl slept curled beneath a faded yellow blanket, hugging a sketchbook instead of a stuffed animal. Cheryl smiled. Emma had fallen asleep drawing again. She carefully lifted the notebook from beneath her daughter's arm. On the last page was another picture. A grocery cart. This time it was overflowing with apples, oranges, milk bread, strawberries, carrots, cereal, and flowers. There were always flowers. Not because Emma thought flowers were necessary. Because she believed grocery carts should carry beautiful things, too. In the corner of the page, she'd written in uneven handwriting, "When Mommy smiles, food tastes better." Cheryl blinked quickly before tears could form. She never wanted Emma to know how often she worried. "Morning sunshine." Emma stretched sleepily. "Did I oversleep?" "No." "What day is it?" "Thursday." Emma sighed dramatically. Only one more day until Friday. Cheryl laughed. You've been counting down since Monday. I like Fridays. Why? Because you're less tired. The answer landed harder than Cheryl expected. Children noticed everything adults tried to hide. While Emma got dressed for school, Cheryl packed lunch: a peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, baby carrots, a handwritten note folded into a square. She left one every day. Sometimes it said, "I'm proud of you." Sometimes, "Be kind." Sometimes, "Remember who you are." Today's note simply read, "The strongest hearts are also the gentlest." Emma collected every note inside a small tin box beneath her bed. She had never thrown away a single one. By 6 o'clock, they were outside waiting for the bus. Emma reached for Cheryl's hand. They stood quietly as commuters hurried past, carrying expensive coffee cups and polished briefcases. No one noticed the mother wearing shoes she'd repaired 3 different times. No one noticed the child carefully avoiding puddles, because she knew replacing sneakers wasn't part of this month's budget. At school, Emma hugged Cheryl tightly. "I'll draw something new tonight. I can't wait to see it." And someday, Emma looked up with complete confidence, "our grocery cart won't have empty spaces anymore." Cheryl crouched until their eyes met. She brushed a loose curl away from Emma's forehead. "Listen to me." Emma nodded. "We don't measure our lives by how full our cart is." Emma waited. "We measure them by whether we earned what's inside honestly." Emma smiled. "We only take what we truly need." It had become their little promise. Every shopping trip ended the same way. If Emma picked something extra, Cheryl would ask gently, "Do we need it?" Emma would think for a moment before answering. Sometimes yes. Usually no. It wasn't about denying joy. It was about learning gratitude. After dropping Emma at school, Cheryl boarded another bus across town. Her shift at Mid-State Distribution Center began at 7. For 8 hours, she inspected damaged food packaging, sorted shipments, recorded inventory discrepancies, and helped organize outgoing deliveries. The work demanded speed and precision. Boxes weighing 40 pounds, concrete floors, constant movement. She rarely complained. The warehouse supervisor often joked that Cheryl's station was the cleanest in the building. If labels were crooked, she straightened them. If inventory numbers didn't match, she stayed late until they did. "If everyone fixes one small thing," she once told a coworker, "big problems don't get a chance to grow." People trusted her. New employees asked Cheryl questions before asking managers. When someone's childcare fell through, Cheryl traded shifts. When an older employee struggled lifting heavy pallets, she quietly helped before anyone asked. She never announced acts of kindness. To her, kindness wasn't something you performed. It was simply part of showing up. At 3:30 p.m., her warehouse shift ended. Most employees drove home. Cheryl caught another bus. By 4:30, she was seated beside her old sewing machine in the corner of the apartment living room. The machine had belonged to her grandmother. Its motor hummed with age, but every stitch remained remarkably straight. School uniforms, curtains, zippers, work pants, wedding hems, anything that could earn another few dollars. Emma sat nearby, finishing homework while drawing between assignments. Occasionally, she'd hold up another sketch. "What do you think?" "I think you're getting better every week." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." The apartment felt small, but never empty. Evenings carried a rhythm they both understood. Homework, dinner, sewing, reading, budget notebook, goodnight hug, repeat. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Later that evening, Cheryl opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk, eggs, spinach, a jar of pasta sauce, 2 apples. Enough for another day. Maybe 2. She quietly calculated tomorrow's grocery budget in her head. She believed she'd planned carefully. She believed every dollar had already been accounted for. She had no way of knowing that one pricing update inside a neighborhood grocery store would soon change everything. Not because of the $27.43 she didn't have, but because of the choice she would make after losing them. Benjamin Carter had learned long ago that people behaved differently when they believed no one important was watching. That was why, despite owning more than 300 Carter Foods grocery stores across the Midwest, he rarely walked into one wearing an expensive suit. Instead, he preferred faded jeans, comfortable boots, and an old brown canvas jacket with a loose button near the left pocket. The jacket had belonged to no famous designer. In fact, Grace had bought it for him nearly 30 years earlier at a thrift store for $12. He had never stopped wearing it. Not because he couldn't afford another one, because every frayed thread reminded him where he had started. Most members of the company's executive board imagined their chairman spent his days in conference rooms overlooking the Columbus skyline, discussing quarterly profits and expansion plans. Benjamin did those things when necessary, but the reports on polished tables never told him what he wanted to know. Spreadsheets couldn't show embarrassment. Financial statements couldn't measure compassion. Profit margins couldn't reveal whether a cashier smiled at an exhausted mother or whether a manager treated an elderly customer with patience. Those were the numbers Benjamin cared about most. Every Thursday evening, without announcing his plans to anyone, he visited a different Carter Foods location. Sometimes he bought nothing more than a loaf of bread. Sometimes he spent an hour sitting near the entrance with a cup of coffee, pretending to read the newspaper, while quietly observing the rhythm of the store. He noticed everything. The teenager who helped a veteran carry groceries to his truck. The bakery employee who slipped an extra dinner roll into a widow's bag because she knew the woman lived alone. The stock clerk who stopped to tie an older man's untied shoelace before he tripped. None of those moments appeared in management reports. Yet Benjamin believed they were the true value of his company. Years earlier, a journalist had asked him the secret behind Carter Foods' success. Benjamin had answered with a sentence that many business magazines thought sounded poetic but impractical. "A grocery store doesn't sell food," he had said. "It sells the feeling people carry home with their groceries." Very few understood what he meant. Grace had. She always had. Long before Carter Foods became a household name, Benjamin and Grace had been two young people trying to survive. Benjamin repaired delivery trucks during the day. Grace worked as a cashier at a neighborhood supermarket while attending community college at night. Money had been painfully tight. There were evenings when dinner consisted of canned soup and crackers because that was all they could afford. But Grace never complained. She believed dignity wasn't measured by what sat on the table, but by how people treated one another around it. Benjamin could still remember one rainy evening, as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. Grace had come home unusually quiet. She removed her shoes, folded her raincoat carefully, and sat at their tiny kitchen table without speaking. "What happened?" Benjamin had asked. She smiled. "I'm okay." He knew immediately that she wasn't. After several minutes, she finally admitted the truth. She had stopped at another grocery store after work to buy milk bread and baby formula for her younger sister's infant. When the total appeared, she realized she was several dollars short. The cashier sighed loudly. The customer behind her complained. Someone muttered that she shouldn't shop if she couldn't pay. Grace had quietly handed back the baby formula. Not because it wasn't important, because it was the most expensive item. "I've never felt smaller," she whispered that night. Benjamin had reached across the table and held her hand. "You did nothing wrong." "I know." "Then why are you crying?" She looked down at the table. "Because people looked at me like I had." The memory never left him. Years later, after Carter Foods began expanding, Benjamin insisted every employee receive training that went beyond customer service. He wanted them to understand something deeper. People rarely remembered exact prices. They always remembered how they had been treated. Grace repeated one sentence so often that it eventually became Benjamin's personal compass. Kindness should never make noise. She believed the greatest acts of generosity happened quietly, without applause, without photographs, without anyone feeling indebted. Benjamin carried those words long after Grace lost her battle with ovarian cancer. She had been gone for 11 years. The jacket remained. So did her voice. Whenever difficult business decisions appeared, Benjamin found himself asking the same silent question. What would Grace notice that everyone else overlooked? That Thursday morning, he arrived at company headquarters before sunrise. The board meeting was exactly what he expected. Charts, forecasts, expansion proposals. Michael Reynolds stood near the large presentation screen discussing profit percentages. Our premium product sales increased by 6%, Michael announced confidently. If we continue reducing labor expenses, next quarter should exceed expectations. Benjamin listened politely. And customer complaints, he asked. Michael blinked. They're within industry averages. Benjamin wasn't satisfied. Within averages isn't the same as improving. Michael shifted uncomfortably. We've addressed the major concerns. Benjamin closed the report. I'd rather lose $1 than lose someone's trust. The room fell silent. Several executives exchanged brief glances. They had heard versions of that sentence many times before. Some admired it. Others secretly believed it was outdated. After the meeting ended, Linda Foster caught up with Benjamin near the elevator. You look distracted. I've been thinking about Grace. Linda smiled gently. That's usually when you visit a store. Benjamin returned the smile. You know me too well, she laughed softly. I've worked beside you for 15 years. Then you know I won't learn anything useful from another report. Which location tonight? The East Hamilton Avenue store. Linda nodded. I'll let the regional manager know you're coming. Benjamin shook his head immediately. No. You don't want anyone informed. I want to see the real store, not the version prepared for the chairman. Linda wasn't surprised. That was always his rule. No warnings, no special cleaning, no rehearsed smiles. Real life only. As evening approached, Benjamin drove himself across Columbus in an aging pickup truck that still had nearly 200,000 miles on the odometer. People often wondered why one of the richest men in Ohio refused to replace it. The answer was simple. The truck still worked. Grace had hated wasting perfectly useful things. He parked near the far end of the Carter Foods parking lot and watched families pushing shopping carts beneath the orange glow of the parking lot lights. Children laughed. Parents checked grocery lists. Teenagers loaded bags into car trunks while talking about weekend plans. Ordinary moments, ordinary people. Benjamin loved places like this because they reminded him that success was never built inside boardrooms alone. It was built in quiet conversations between neighbors, in tired parents buying dinner after long shifts, in workers who greeted strangers with respect. He adjusted the collar of his worn brown jacket, picked up a shopping basket, and walked through the automatic doors. He had no idea that before the hour was over, he would witness a scene that would change not only Cheryl Murphy's future, but his own understanding of what Grace had meant all those years ago when she whispered that kindness should never make noise. Friday evenings were always the busiest at Carter Foods. By 7:30 p.m., every checkout lane was open. Shopping carts rolled across the polished floor in every direction, and the scent of warm rotisserie chicken drifted through the store. Families hurried to finish their weekend shopping before heading home. Parents compared prices, children reached for candy near the registers, and employees moved with practiced speed to keep long lines from growing even longer. Cheryl Murphy entered the store with Emma just after 8 o'clock. She carried a folded grocery list inside the pocket of her denim jacket. The list wasn't written randomly. Every item had been carefully planned during the week after comparing advertisements, digital coupons, and store discounts. Emma reached for a shopping cart. "The little one?" she asked. Cheryl smiled. "The small cart is enough." Emma nodded proudly and pushed the cart with both hands. As always, they followed the same routine. Fresh vegetables first, fruit only if it was on sale, milk, eggs, whole wheat bread, chicken if the price hadn't changed. Nothing went into the cart without Cheryl quietly checking the shelf label. She picked up a carton of strawberries and studied the sign. $2.99, she murmured. Emma's eyes brightened. "Really?" Cheryl smiled. "Looks like we got lucky today." Emma carefully placed the strawberries into the cart, as though they were something precious. "They'll be for Saturday breakfast. And maybe with pancakes. If we can make the numbers work." Emma understood exactly what that meant. Throughout the store, Cheryl quietly calculated every dollar in her head. Years of surviving on a tight budget had turned arithmetic into instinct. She knew approximately what the total should be before reaching the register. Benjamin Carter noticed them almost immediately, not because Cheryl looked different from anyone else, because she did something few shoppers bothered to do. When Emma accidentally placed a bag of apples in the wrong section of the cart, Cheryl stopped walking. "Gently," she reminded her daughter. Emma looked confused. "They'll bruise." The little girl immediately rearranged everything. Later, when she changed her mind about a box of cereal, she started placing it on the nearest shelf. Cheryl stopped her again. "No," Emma looked up. "It doesn't belong there." Without another word, Cheryl walked all the way back to the cereal aisle and returned the box to its proper place. Benjamin watched quietly from several aisles away. Most people wouldn't have noticed. He did. Small habits often revealed the biggest truths. As they continued shopping, Cheryl compared prices between two brands of pasta. She selected the less expensive one. Emma never complained. She simply helped place it neatly inside the cart. Benjamin smiled to himself. Grace would have liked this child. Not because she was quiet, because she had already learned respect without losing joy. Meanwhile, at the front of the store, Olivia Grant reviewed the evening sales reports on a handheld tablet. The district office had recently increased pressure on store managers to improve checkout speed and reduce pricing overrides. Every delay was tracked. Every complaint was recorded. Every statistic affected performance bonuses. Olivia wasn't a cruel woman, but months of impossible expectations had slowly replaced her patience with efficiency. She no longer saw customers first. She saw transactions. When Cheryl finally joined Register 6, Daniel Perez greeted her with a tired but sincere smile. "Evening." "Hi." Emma carefully unloaded the groceries one by one. Heavy items first, bread last. Just as Cheryl had taught her. Daniel scanned each item. Beep, beep. Beep! The total climbed steadily. Everything matched Cheryl's mental calculation, until the strawberries. The register paused. A message appeared. Promotion expired. Instead of $2.99, the strawberries scanned at $6.79. Daniel frowned. "That's strange." He checked the screen again. "It says the promotion ended at 6 o'clock. Cheryl's smile disappeared. "I picked them up because the sign still said $2.99. "I'm sorry." Daniel looked toward the produce section. "The sign probably hasn't been changed yet." He called for a price check. 2 minutes passed. Customers behind Cheryl began shifting impatiently. A father glanced at his watch. Someone sighed loudly. A teenager tapped his foot against the floor. Finally, an employee returned. The sale ended. Daniel looked apologetically at Cheryl. I have to charge the current price unless a manager approves the adjustment. He pressed the assistance button. Olivia arrived moments later. What seems to be the problem? Daniel explained quietly. Olivia barely looked at Cheryl before answering. The promotion expired. The sign is still on the shelf. We'll remove it. But she picked them because the system price is correct. Daniel hesitated. Could we honor the shelf price? Olivia shook her head. We've had too many overrides this month. She turned toward Cheryl. The total is now $123.43. Cheryl slowly opened her wallet. She counted every bill, every coin, then checked the envelope she carried for groceries. Her fingers stopped. She already knew. She looked back up. I'm short. Daniel quietly recalculated. $27.43. The words echoed far louder than their volume. Silence spread through the checkout lane. Emma lowered her eyes. Cheryl inhaled slowly. Okay. She forced a small smile. We'll put some things back. Daniel nodded reluctantly. I'm sorry. Olivia crossed her arms. Please decide quickly. The line is getting long. Behind them, someone muttered. This always happens. Another voice answered. If you can't afford it, don't fill the cart. Emma gripped the handle tighter. Cheryl ignored the comments. She picked up the strawberries first. No, Emma whispered. Cheryl knelt beside her daughter. We need the milk more. Emma swallowed hard. Then, without arguing, she took the strawberries and placed them gently on the conveyor belt. It's okay, Mommy. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. We can have them another time. Daniel looked away. He suddenly found the register screen impossible to focus on. Cheryl continued removing items. Greek yogurt, chicken breasts, whole grain cereal, fresh spinach. Each decision was made carefully, nutrition competing against necessity, until only the essentials remained. Benjamin stood only a few feet away now. No one paid attention to the older man holding a basket with a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs. He watched Cheryl's face. She wasn't angry. She wasn't begging. She wasn't blaming anyone. She simply accepted the situation with quiet dignity. Then she did something that caught his attention even more. Instead of leaving the unwanted groceries beside the register, as many customers did, Cheryl carefully gathered every item into her arms. I'll put these back. Olivia looked surprised. You don't have to. I know. Cheryl offered a polite smile. But someone else is waiting to buy them. Emma immediately picked up the strawberries. I know where these go. Mother and daughter walked away from the checkout together. No complaints, no bitterness, just quiet resolve. Benjamin watched them disappear down the produce aisle. He remembered another young woman carrying milk through another grocery store decades earlier. He heard Grace's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. People remember how you make them feel. He turned back toward Register 6. Daniel was still staring after Cheryl. Olivia had already moved to another lane. Benjamin stepped forward, placed his basket on the conveyor belt, and spoke so softly that only Daniel could hear. I'd like to pay for every item she selected. Daniel looked up in surprise. The groceries she put back, all of them. She already left. Benjamin reached into his wallet. I know. He glanced toward the produce aisle, where Emma was returning the strawberries to the display with extraordinary care. Please don't tell her who did it. Daniel stared at the older man for a moment, unsure whether he had heard him correctly. You want all of it? He asked quietly. Benjamin Carter nodded. Everything that was in her cart. Daniel glanced toward the produce section, where Cheryl and Emma were still returning groceries to their proper shelves. They've already started putting everything back. Then let's not waste any more time. Benjamin slid a simple black credit card across the counter. There was no platinum shine, no elaborate logo that hinted at extraordinary wealth. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary card carried by an ordinary customer. Daniel hesitated. What should I tell her? Benjamin smiled gently. Tell her the truth. Daniel waited. Someone wanted her family to enjoy dinner tonight. And your name? Benjamin shook his head. The gift isn't about me. Daniel processed the payment while Benjamin quietly watched Cheryl from across the store. She moved through each aisle with the same care she had shown while shopping. The strawberries returned to the refrigerated display. The yogurt went back beside identical containers. The spinach was placed exactly where it belonged. Emma even turned one package around so its label faced forward. Benjamin noticed every detail. Neither of them hurried. Neither of them abandoned anything where it didn't belong. Even disappointment, it seemed, was handled with respect. A few minutes later, Cheryl and Emma returned to the checkout, carrying only the groceries they could afford. Daniel cleared his throat. Mrs. Murphy. Cheryl looked up. Yes. For a second, he forgot the sentence he had practiced. Then he smiled. Your groceries have already been paid for. Cheryl frowned politely. I'm sorry. Daniel pointed toward the bags waiting beside the register. Everything. She looked at the receipt, then at Daniel. There must be a mistake. There isn't. Emma's eyes grew wide. Our food? Daniel nodded. All of it. Cheryl immediately shook her head. I can't accept someone else's payment. Daniel expected that answer. The customer who paid asked me to tell you something. She remained silent. He said your family deserves to enjoy dinner tonight. And who is he? I'm sorry. Daniel smiled apologetically. He didn't want his name shared. For several long seconds, Cheryl simply stood there. Around them, customers continued checking out. Registers beeped, shopping carts rolled past, conversations blended into ordinary Friday evening noise. Yet inside Cheryl's heart, everything had become strangely quiet. Emma tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. Mom. Cheryl slowly exhaled. She looked at the grocery bags again. Then she closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, there were tears waiting, but none escaped. Instead, she nodded. Please tell whoever it was. Her voice almost broke. Thank you. Daniel smiled. I wish I could. Cheryl gathered the bags carefully into the shopping cart. Not a single movement felt rushed. She treated the unexpected gift exactly as she treated everything else, with gratitude and dignity. Outside, the summer evening had cooled. A light breeze drifted across the parking lot. Emma walked beside the cart, still looking inside every few seconds as though afraid the groceries might somehow disappear. The strawberries are really coming home, she whispered. Cheryl laughed softly. They are. Emma smiled so brightly that Cheryl felt something loosen inside her chest. They loaded the groceries into their aging blue sedan. The car had more than 200,000 miles on it and required a gentle push on the driver's door before it would close completely. Emma climbed into this passenger seat. Before Cheryl started the engine, Emma asked quietly, Do you think it was an angel? Cheryl smiled. I think angels usually look more ordinary than we expect. So, maybe just a person. Maybe. Emma looked through the windshield. I hope they're happy. So do I. They drove home without turning on the radio. Neither wanted to interrupt the silence. Sometimes gratitude needed quiet more than conversation. Back at their apartment, Emma insisted on helping unpack every bag. She placed the milk into the refrigerator, the bread into the cabinet, the apples into the fruit bowl. Finally, she picked up the strawberries with both hands. They're still cold. Cheryl smiled. They're supposed to be. Emma giggled. I know. While Cheryl prepared a simple dinner, Emma washed the strawberries carefully under running water. She counted them. There are 16. Then we'll each have 8. Emma immediately shook her head. You should have more. No. You work harder. Cheryl turned from the stove. And you grow faster. Emma thought for a moment. 8 each. 8 each. They sat together at the small kitchen table. Pasta, salad, fresh strawberries afterward. Nothing about the meal looked extravagant. Yet somehow it felt like the richest dinner they'd shared in months. Halfway through eating, Emma asked, Can we pray for the person? Cheryl reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. I think they'd like that. Emma closed her eyes. Dear God, thank you for whoever helped us today. She paused. Please help them when they need someone too. Another pause. And if they ever come to our grocery store again, she smiled. Let us be kind to them first. Cheryl lowered her head. It was one of the simplest prayers she had ever heard. It was also one of the most beautiful. Later that evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Cheryl opened her familiar blue notebook. She wrote down every grocery expense exactly as planned. Then she stopped. She looked at the envelope containing the $20 she had earned from hemming a neighbor's work pants. She had intended to save it for next week's gas. Instead, she stared at it for several minutes. A memory surfaced. Not of today, of years earlier. A stranger had once helped her carry Emma's stroller onto a city bus without saying a word. The man had stepped off at the next stop before she could thank him. She had never forgotten him. Kindness, she realized, had a strange way of staying with people. It never really disappeared. It simply waited for another chance to continue. She closed the notebook and slipped the $20 bill into her wallet instead of the emergency envelope. The next morning before work, she knew exactly where she was going. Not to search for the mysterious stranger, not to repay a debt she could never calculate, but to begin keeping the promise she had whispered to Emma on the drive home. One day, she had said, we'll do this for someone else. She had not expected that one day would arrive much sooner than either of them imagined. Saturday mornings usually moved at a slower pace than weekdays, but Cheryl Murphy still woke before sunrise. Habit was stronger than the calendar. By 6:00 a.m., a load of laundry was already spinning downstairs in the laundromat. Oatmeal simmered gently on the stove, and the blue notebook rested open beside a mug of coffee that had begun to cool. Emma wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. It smells like cinnamon. It is cinnamon. I thought Saturdays were pancake days. Cheryl smiled apologetically. They are. Next Saturday. Emma accepted the answer without disappointment. She had learned long ago that changing plans didn't mean giving up hope. While they ate breakfast, Emma suddenly looked up. Do you think the person from the store likes strawberries too? Cheryl laughed softly. I hope so. I hope someone buys them strawberries someday. The innocent wish lingered in the room long after breakfast had ended. At 9 o'clock, Cheryl folded the crisp $20 bill into her wallet and headed toward Carter Foods. Not to shop, not to search for the stranger, to keep a promise. Daniel Perez was collecting abandoned shopping baskets near the entrance when he recognized her. For one brief second, panic crossed his face. Had she come to return the groceries? To insist on finding the mysterious customer instead, Cheryl smiled warmly. Good morning. Morning? I was hoping someone could help me. Of course. She reached into her wallet and unfolded the $20 bill. I'd like to leave this with customer service. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry. If another family comes through the checkout and they're just a little short, she glanced toward the registers. Please use this. Daniel stared at the bill. You don't have to. I know. But someone reminded my daughter yesterday that kindness still exists. She smiled. I don't want that lesson to end with us. Daniel felt something tighten in his throat. He accepted the bill carefully, almost reverently. I'll make sure it helps someone. I trust you. She thanked him and turned toward the exit. No speech, no request for recognition, no questions about the stranger. She simply left. Daniel watched through the glass doors until her old blue sedan disappeared from the parking lot. Only then did he notice another familiar customer standing near the floral department. Benjamin Carter had witnessed the entire exchange. He slowly walked over. How much? Daniel looked up. Excuse me? The money she left. $20? Benjamin smiled faintly. Exactly what she earned yesterday. Daniel's eyes widened. You knew. I know enough. Daniel lowered his voice. Mr. Carter. Benjamin raised a hand gently. Today I'm just another customer. Daniel nodded immediately. I understand. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Benjamin looked toward the entrance where Cheryl had disappeared. Did she ask who paid? No. Did she try to return anything? No. Benjamin nodded slowly. What she did instead tells me much more. Daniel hesitated before speaking. I've worked here almost 3 years. Benjamin listened. I've seen people argue over expired coupons worth less than $1. He paused. I've seen customers demand free gift cards because they had to wait 5 extra minutes. Another pause. But I've never seen someone who was struggling come back to help the next stranger. Benjamin looked at him. Now you know why I wanted to remain anonymous. Daniel smiled. I think I finally do. Benjamin wandered through the store for another hour, but his thoughts remained fixed on Cheryl. Most people believed generosity created gratitude. What fascinated Benjamin was something deeper. Gratitude had created generosity. That difference mattered. Late that afternoon, he drove to Carter Foods headquarters instead of home. Linda Foster was still in her office reviewing community partnership proposals when she heard a knock. She looked up and smiled. I had a feeling you'd stop by. Benjamin entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. You know me too well. She accepted one gratefully. So, he sat across from her desk. I met someone. Linda raised an eyebrow. That sounds more interesting than your usual store visit. Benjamin described everything. The expired promotion, the missing $27.43, the strawberries, the quiet dignity. Then Cheryl's return the following morning. Linda listened without interrupting. When he finished, she remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she asked, What are you thinking? Benjamin leaned back in his chair. I'm thinking we've spent years investing in buildings. And we should invest more carefully in people. Linda smiled. You already do. Not enough. He stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown Columbus. I don't want to hand her money. No. That would solve this week's problem. Linda nodded. But not next year's. Benjamin looked at the busy streets below. Grace used to say that helping someone stand is kinder than carrying them. Linda remembered hearing Grace say those exact words years earlier. So, what do you want to do? Benjamin turned back. I want to know who Cheryl Murphy really is. You mean her employment history? No. Financial records? No. Linda folded her arms. Then what? Benjamin answered without hesitation. I want to know how she treats people when no one important is watching. Linda smiled knowingly. I think you've already begun finding that answer. He smiled back. Maybe. Over the next several days, Benjamin quietly requested only publicly available information through the company's community outreach office. No private investigations, no invasions of Cheryl's life. He simply wanted to understand the woman whose first instinct after receiving kindness had been to pass it forward. What he learned surprised him. Cheryl had worked at Mid-State Distribution Center for nearly 7 years. Excellent attendance, strong performance reviews, no disciplinary actions. She had declined overtime on only 2 occasions, both because Emma had been hospitalized with asthma. Her supervisors consistently described her with the same words: reliable, organized, calm under pressure. One handwritten comment from an annual review caught Benjamin's attention. If Cheryl sees a problem, she fixes it before anyone asks. Benjamin read that sentence twice, then a third time. He quietly closed the file. Grace would have smiled, because she always believed character revealed itself in ordinary moments, not on someone's best day, on their hardest one. Benjamin looked again at the photograph of Grace that stood on the corner of his office desk. For the first time in many months, he found himself speaking aloud. "I think you would have liked Cheryl." The office remained silent. Yet somehow in that silence he felt as though Grace had already answered. Benjamin Carter rarely trusted first impressions, no matter how inspiring they seemed. Over the years he had watched charismatic people crumble under pressure and quiet people become extraordinary leaders when given responsibility. One generous moment, however moving, was never enough to understand a person's character. Still, Cheryl Murphy stayed on his mind. Not because she had accepted help, because she had immediately looked for someone else to help. On Monday morning, Benjamin asked Linda Foster to arrange a visit to Mid-State Distribution Center. He didn't mention Cheryl by name. Officially, the company was exploring new partnerships to reduce food waste, and the distribution center was one of several facilities Carter Foods occasionally worked with. It was a reasonable excuse. By 10 o'clock, Benjamin and Linda were walking through the warehouse wearing reflective safety vests and protective helmets. Forklifts moved steadily between towering shelves stacked with packaged food. Conveyor belts hummed across the building while workers inspected boxes, scanned inventory, and prepared shipments for grocery stores across central Ohio. The warehouse manager, Harold Simmons, greeted them with a firm handshake. "We're honored to have you here." Benjamin smiled politely. "We're here to learn." Harold led them through several departments, explaining shipping schedules and inventory systems. Benjamin listened carefully, asking practical questions that surprised everyone around him. How often do damaged labels delay deliveries? Which products are most frequently wasted? What causes the biggest bottlenecks? The questions weren't designed to impress. They reflected genuine curiosity. As they rounded another aisle, Harold suddenly pointed toward a section where several employees stood around an overloaded pallet. "We've got a little situation." One of the boxes at the bottom had collapsed, causing dozens of cartons to lean dangerously. "If that falls," Harold muttered, "we'll lose half a day's shipment." Before anyone could respond, a woman stepped forward, Cheryl. She studied the leaning stack for only a few seconds. "Don't push it," she called calmly. The younger employees froze. "If you push from the side, the weight shifts." She picked up a marker and quickly sketched a simple diagram on the back of a shipping label. "You unload these 3 rows first," she pointed. "Then support the center with an empty pallet." One worker looked uncertain. "Will that hold?" "It will if everyone lifts together." There was no panic in her voice, only quiet confidence. Within 5 minutes, the unstable stack had been secured without losing a single box. Harold let out a relieved breath. "I was about to call maintenance." Cheryl smiled. "No need." Benjamin exchanged a quick glance with Linda. Neither said a word. They simply kept watching. As the tour continued, Benjamin noticed something else. People naturally drifted toward Cheryl. A new employee asked where to find replacement labels. She stopped what she was doing and showed him personally, An older worker struggled to read a faded shipping code. Without making him feel embarrassed, Cheryl quietly checked it herself and updated the paperwork. Another employee accidentally entered incorrect inventory numbers into the system. Instead of criticizing him, Cheryl pulled a chair beside his workstation. Let's figure out where it happened. 10 minutes later, the mistake had been corrected. The young man looked embarrassed. I keep slowing everyone down. Cheryl shook her head. No. He looked at her. You're learning. Then she smiled. We all looked new once. Benjamin watched the young man's shoulders relax almost instantly. Leadership, he thought, wasn't loud. It made other people feel capable. During lunch break, Harold invited Benjamin and Linda into a small conference room. Coffee was served in paper cups. The conversation turned toward staffing. Harold leaned back in his chair. If I could clone one employee, it'd be Cheryl. Benjamin looked interested. What makes her different? Harold laughed. Where do I start? He counted on his fingers. Never late. Never blames. Never wastes supplies. Never refuses difficult assignments. He paused. And somehow she fixes problems before I even know they exist. Linda smiled. Have you considered promoting her? Harold sighed. I've wanted to. So why haven't you? Budget. One word. Heavy enough to explain years of disappointment. We lost 2 supervisor positions during restructuring. He shrugged apologetically. She's doing work above her pay grade already. Benjamin remained thoughtful. What does she say about it? Harold smiled. Nothing. Nothing. She just keeps working. Benjamin looked through the conference room window. Across the warehouse floor, Cheryl was helping another employee organize a shipment that had arrived out of sequence. She wasn't supervising. She wasn't assigned to solve that problem. She simply couldn't walk past disorder without trying to improve it. Grace used to do the same thing. The realization caught Benjamin by surprise. Not because Cheryl reminded him of Grace in personality. No one ever could. But because both women shared the same instinct. They believed responsibility wasn't something written into a job description. It was a choice. After lunch, Benjamin thanked Harold for the tour. Before leaving, he stopped beside a bulletin board displaying employee recognition cards. Most contained short compliments from coworkers. One card stood out. It was written in thick blue marker. Thank you, Cheryl, for staying after your shift to help me finish inventory when my son was in the hospital. I'll never forget it. No signature. Just gratitude. Benjamin stared at it for several seconds. No framed award, no trophy, just a handwritten note pinned beside safety reminders. Somehow it meant more. Outside, Linda finally broke the silence. Well, Benjamin smiled. I found what I was looking for. You believe she's ready? I believe she's been ready for years. Linda nodded. The question is whether someone will finally give her the chance. Benjamin looked toward the warehouse entrance where Cheryl had just stepped outside for a short break. She sat alone on a wooden bench, eating a simple lunch packed in a reusable container. Half a turkey sandwich, carrot sticks, an apple. Before taking the first bite, she noticed a stray shopping receipt blowing across the parking lot. She stood, picked it up, and dropped it into a trash bin before returning to her lunch. No one had asked her to do it. No one thanked her. She probably assumed no one had even noticed. Benjamin smiled quietly. He had. As he climbed into his truck, one decision became perfectly clear. Helping Cheryl didn't mean writing a check. It meant opening a door that should have been opened long ago. And this time she would have to walk through it on her own. 3 days later, an email arrived in Cheryl Murphy's inbox just before the end of her warehouse shift. She almost deleted it. Messages from unfamiliar addresses usually meant advertisements, schedule updates, or mandatory training sessions. She opened it only because the subject line mentioned a community partnership with Carter Foods. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the screen. The Carter Community Initiative was launching a pilot program designed to reduce food waste while improving access to fresh groceries for working families. The organization was looking for a logistics and community operations coordinator, someone who understood inventory management distribution and the everyday realities of families living paycheck to paycheck. The qualifications felt strangely familiar: warehouse experience, inventory organization, team leadership, problem-solving, community engagement. Cheryl quietly read the description twice, then a third time. One sentence caught her attention more than any other. "We are looking for character as much as experience." She smiled to herself. Character wasn't something most job postings mentioned. Before she could think further, Harold Simmons walked over carrying a clipboard. "You got it too." "The email," he nodded. "I forwarded your name to Human Resources." Cheryl looked up surprised. "You did?" "I didn't recommend you." He grinned. "I recommended that they not overlook you." She laughed softly. "That's different." "Very." Harold leaned against a nearby pallet. "You've spent years solving problems nobody asked you to solve." "I was just doing my job." "Exactly." He pointed toward the email. "Now apply." Cheryl hesitated. "There will be people with management degrees." "There will." "People with better resumes." "There will." She folded her arms. "What if I'm wasting everyone's time?" Harold answered without hesitation. "The only guaranteed failure is deciding you're not good enough before anyone else gets the chance." His words followed Cheryl all the way home. That evening after dinner, Emma sat at the kitchen table coloring another grocery cart. This time the cart looked different. Instead of being filled only with food, Emma had drawn little hearts floating above it. "What are those?" Cheryl asked. "They're kindness." "You can draw kindness." Emma nodded confidently. "You can't see it, but you can always tell when it's there." Children had an astonishing ability to make complicated truths sound effortless. Cheryl sat beside her with the laptop. "I need your opinion." Emma gasped dramatically. "My opinion?" "Yes." "That's a very important job." "It is." Cheryl turned the screen so Emma could read the job posting. "I don't know if I should apply." Emma read silently for several moments. Then she looked up. "Do you know how to help people?" "I try." "Do you know how to organize things?" "I think so." "Do you care?" Cheryl smiled. "Very much." Emma shrugged. "Then it sounds like they're looking for you." Children, Cheryl thought, rarely complicated what adults overthought. After Emma went to bed, Cheryl opened a blank document for her resume. It hadn't been updated in nearly 6 years. She listed her warehouse responsibilities: inventory tracking, quality control, shipment coordination, training new employees, process improvements. The page looked ordinary, almost disappointingly ordinary. She closed her eyes. Was this really enough? For several minutes, she considered closing the laptop. Then she remembered standing at Register 6 with $27.43 missing. She remembered believing the answer had been to remove things from her cart. Maybe she realized she had spent years removing possibilities from her own life the same way. Quietly, automatically, without asking whether they still belonged. She reopened the document. Instead of writing only what she had been paid to do, she began writing what she had actually done. Developed inventory organization methods that reduced misplaced shipments, mentored new employees, improved workflow efficiency during seasonal demand, coordinated volunteer food donations through a local church. By midnight, the resume looked very different. Not exaggerated, simply complete. The following Tuesday, she arrived at the Carter Community Center for interviews. The waiting room held 12 candidates. Some wore tailored business suits. Others carried leather portfolios. One introduced himself as a regional operations manager. Another mentioned an MBA. Cheryl suddenly became very aware of her modest navy blazer that she'd bought secondhand 3 years earlier. She almost turned around. A receptionist smiled warmly. "Good morning." "Morning." "Name?" "Cheryl Murphy." The receptionist checked the list. "We've been expecting you." Those simple words eased something inside her. One by one, candidates disappeared into interview rooms. Some emerged 20 minutes later looking confident. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Finally, the receptionist called Cheryl's name. She entered a bright conference room where 3 interviewers waited. Linda Foster sat in the center. 2 operations directors occupied the remaining seats. Benjamin Carter was nowhere to be seen. Exactly as planned. Linda smiled. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me." The interview began with familiar questions. Experience, scheduling, inventory, conflict resolution, Cheryl answered honestly. When she didn't know something, she admitted it instead of pretending. About halfway through, Linda placed a photograph on the table. It showed several grocery carts filled with damaged produce that could no longer be sold. "What would you do with these?" One candidate earlier had apparently suggested disposal. Another recommended immediate donation. Cheryl studied the picture carefully. Then she looked up. "I'd sort them first." Linda smiled slightly. "Why?" "Because they're not all the same." She pointed toward the image. "Some are unsuitable for anyone." Another section. "Some can be processed." Another. "Some are still perfectly fresh." She paused. "Waste usually happens because people stop looking closely." The room grew quiet. One interviewer leaned forward. "And after sorting, I'd partner with community kitchens, food banks, and local farms." She smiled gently. "But first I'd ask what they actually need." Linda tilted her head. "Why?" "Because helping people without listening often creates different problems." Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Linda thanked her. As Cheryl walked toward the exit, she wasn't sure whether she had impressed anyone. She only knew she had answered as herself. Outside, she breathed deeply. For the first time in years, she realized something unexpected. Whether she received the job or not, she had finally stopped assuming she didn't belong in the room. Several floors above, behind a window overlooking the courtyard, Benjamin Carter had quietly watched Cheryl leave the building. He smiled. The interview had confirmed everything he'd hoped. He hadn't opened a door for someone who expected to be rescued. He had simply invited the right person to knock. Cheryl Murphy didn't expect the phone call. She was halfway through organizing a shipment of canned vegetables when her cell phone vibrated inside her locker during lunch break. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered. "Hello, this is Cheryl." A warm voice replied. "Miss Murphy, this is Linda Foster from the Carter Community Initiative." Cheryl immediately straightened in her chair. "Yes, ma'am." "I hope I'm not interrupting your lunch." "No, not at all." "I'm calling to let you know you've been selected as one of 3 finalists." For a brief moment, Cheryl forgot how to breathe. "The finalists?" "Yes." "There were 12 applicants." "There were." Linda smiled on the other end of the line. "The next step isn't another traditional interview." "What is it?" "We'd like each finalist to solve a real problem." Cheryl listened carefully. "For the next 48 hours, you'll work with a small planning team. We want practical solutions, not perfect presentations." "I understand." "We're less interested in impressive words than in thoughtful decisions." After thanking Linda, Cheryl sat motionless for several seconds. 3 finalists. She hadn't expected even that much. When she returned to the warehouse floor, Harold noticed the smile she was unsuccessfully trying to hide. "Good news." She nodded. "I made the final round." Harold grinned so broadly that several nearby employees looked over. "I knew it." "You didn't." "I absolutely did." She laughed. "You've had more confidence in me than I've had in myself." Harold shook his head. "No." He pointed toward the rows of organized inventory surrounding them. "I've just been paying attention longer." That evening, Emma nearly dropped her backpack when Cheryl told her the news. "You mean they picked you?" "They picked 3 people." Emma ignored the clarification completely. "I knew they would." "You sounded very certain." "Because you already do that job." Cheryl looked puzzled. Emma shrugged. "You help people. You organize things. You fix problems." She smiled proudly. "They're just giving you a different building." The next morning, Cheryl arrived at Carter Foods headquarters for the final assessment. The 3 finalists were each assigned a separate conference room. On the table sat several folders, maps, inventory reports, and community demographic studies. Linda entered carrying a box filled with photographs. "This exercise is based on a real challenge." She spread the photos across the table. Some showed grocery store shelves filled with produce approaching expiration dates. Others showed community food pantries with nearly empty refrigerators. There were pictures of senior centers, school cafeterias, church kitchens, and apartment complexes. Linda folded her hands. "Every week our stores dispose of thousands of pounds of perfectly edible food." Cheryl nodded. "I've seen similar waste at the warehouse." "The question isn't whether we should reduce waste." Linda smiled. "It's how." She left Cheryl alone with the materials. For nearly an hour, Cheryl studied every page without writing a single word. She noticed patterns. Certain neighborhoods lacked transportation. Some food pantries received too much bread, but not enough vegetables. Several community kitchens needed smaller deliveries more frequently, instead of large weekly shipments. Most reports focused only on quantities. Very few mentioned people. Finally, Cheryl began sketching. Not a polished business proposal. A working map. Colored arrows connected grocery stores with schools. Warehouse routes merged with church kitchens. Unused delivery trucks appeared during hours they normally sat idle. She added handwritten notes beside each route. Flexible pickup times, volunteer coordination, local refrigeration partnerships. Then she drew something unexpected. A shopping cart. Inside it, she wrote one sentence. "Meet families where dignity begins." When Linda returned later that afternoon, Cheryl stood beside a whiteboard covered with diagrams. She didn't use presentation slides. She simply explained how everything connected. "If we only donate leftovers," Cheryl said, "people remain dependent on leftovers." Linda listened carefully. "But if we organize the system differently," she pointed toward the map. "Fresh food reaches families before it becomes waste." One operations director asked, "Wouldn't daily coordination cost more?" "At first." "And later," Cheryl smiled. "Waste is expensive too." Another interviewer leaned forward. "What about volunteers?" "I'd use volunteers." She paused. "But not for everything." The interviewer looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because communities become stronger when people have jobs, not only charity." Silence settled around the room. Linda finally asked, "What would success look like after 1 year?" Cheryl didn't mention financial savings. She didn't mention publicity. Instead, she answered quietly, "I'd like children to stop thinking fresh fruit is something special." The room became completely still. She continued, "I'd like parents to shop without feeling embarrassed if they're using assistance." Another pause. "And I'd like grocery employees to know they're feeding neighbors, not processing transactions." No one interrupted. After the presentation ended, Cheryl thanked the panel and gathered her papers. She left believing she'd done her best. Nothing more. Later that afternoon, the evaluation committee assembled in a larger conference room. Benjamin Carter sat quietly at the far end of the table. The interviewers discussed each finalist in turn. The first candidate possessed outstanding corporate experience. The second had impressive academic credentials. Then they reached Cheryl. One executive flipped through her evaluation. She lacks senior management experience. Another nodded. True. Linda looked around the table. What she lacks in titles, she makes up for in judgment. The room remained divided. Benjamin finally spoke. What did each candidate believe they were solving? The executives exchanged uncertain glances. The first reduced disposal costs, Benjamin continued. The second optimized logistics. He looked toward Cheryl's proposal lying on the table. And Miss Murphy, Linda smiled. She rebuilt the relationship between grocery stores and communities. Benjamin nodded. Exactly. He picked up Cheryl's hand-drawn map. No glossy graphics, no expensive formatting. Just practical ideas, written in careful handwriting. Near the bottom corner, he noticed the small sketch of the shopping cart. Below it, Cheryl had added another sentence in tiny letters. No family should feel ashamed for needing food. Benjamin stared at those words. He remembered Emma gently placing the strawberries back onto the conveyor belt. He remembered Cheryl quietly returning every unwanted item to its proper shelf. He remembered Grace sitting silently at their kitchen table decades earlier after surrendering baby formula she couldn't afford. Without realizing it, Cheryl had answered a question Benjamin had been carrying for years. How do you build a company that feeds people without ever taking away their dignity? He carefully placed the proposal back on the table. Then he looked around the room. I believe we've found our coordinator. Cheryl Murphy received the official offer on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. She had just finished labeling inventory when Harold Simmons waved her over from across the warehouse floor. There's someone on the phone asking for you. Cheryl wiped her hands on her work gloves before picking up the receiver in the supervisor's office. This is Cheryl. Congratulations. She immediately recognized Linda Foster's voice. You've been selected as the new Logistics and Community Operations Coordinator for the Carter Community Initiative. For a moment, Cheryl couldn't answer. She looked through the office window at the warehouse she had walked into almost every weekday for 7 years. Rows of pallets, forklifts moving steadily, co-workers she had laughed with, worried with, and grown beside. So, Linda asked gently, will you accept? Cheryl smiled through unexpected tears. Yes. When she hung up, Harold was waiting outside the office with folded arms. Well, she nodded. I got the job. Before Cheryl could say another word, Harold pulled her into a quick, awkward hug. Several employees looked over. Someone started clapping. Within seconds, the applause spread across the warehouse. Cheryl covered her face, embarrassed. You all are going to make me cry. One of the newer employees laughed. Too late. That evening, Emma nearly tackled her mother the moment she walked through the apartment door. You got it. I did. Emma spun around the tiny living room. I told you. You certainly did. So now you help even more people. I hope so. Emma disappeared into her bedroom and returned carrying her sketchbook. I made something. She handed Cheryl a fresh drawing. It showed the familiar shopping cart. But this time, the cart wasn't full of groceries. Inside were smiling people, holding hands. At the front of the cart stood a woman with curly hair. Behind her stood an older man wearing a brown jacket. Neither figure had a face, yet Cheryl somehow felt strangely connected to the picture. What made you draw this? She asked. Emma shrugged. Because I think kindness pushes people farther than wheels do. Cheryl kissed the top of her daughter's head. You have a beautiful way of seeing the world." The following Monday marked Cheryl's first day at Carter Foods headquarters. The building's glass entrance reflected the morning sunlight across polished stone floors. Employees carrying laptops hurried through the lobby with practiced confidence. Cheryl suddenly felt very small. She adjusted the sleeve of her navy blazer, the same second-hand blazer she'd worn to the interview. A receptionist greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Miss Murphy." "Good morning. We've been expecting you." Those words still sounded unfamiliar. Linda met her in the lobby a few moments later. "You made it. I almost convinced myself to turn around." Linda smiled knowingly. Most people who care deeply feel that way. As they walked through the building, Linda introduced Cheryl to various departments: community partnerships, supply chain innovation, regional operations. Everyone welcomed her politely. Yet Cheryl couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow wandered into someone else's life. Finally, Linda stopped outside a conference room. "There's one more person I'd like you to meet." She opened the door. Benjamin Carter stood beside the window overlooking downtown Columbus. He wore a charcoal suit instead of the worn brown jacket Cheryl had seen only from a distance at the grocery store. She didn't recognize him. Not yet. Benjamin turned and smiled. "Miss Murphy." She extended her hand. "It's an honor to meet you." "The honor is mine." His handshake was warm but unassuming. Nothing about him suggested the wealth newspapers often associated with his name. He gestured toward 2 comfortable chairs. "Please." They sat. Linda quietly excused herself, leaving them alone. For several moments, Benjamin simply studied Cheryl with thoughtful curiosity, not as an executive evaluating an employee, as one human being trying to understand another. "I've read your proposal several times," he said. "I'm glad. You wrote something I'd like to ask about." Cheryl nodded. "You said communities become stronger when people have jobs, not only charity." "Yes." "What made you believe that?" She considered the question carefully. "My mother worked 2 jobs." Benjamin listened without interrupting. "When neighbors helped us, they never made us feel ashamed." She smiled faintly. "But the greatest gift anyone ever gave my mother wasn't money." "What was it?" "A chance to work." Benjamin leaned back slightly. "Tell me more." "There was a woman who owned a small tailoring shop." Cheryl looked out the window for a moment. "My mother couldn't afford Christmas presents 1 year." Benjamin remained silent. "The shop owner hired her for 3 weeks." "Temporary work?" Cheryl nodded. "My mother came home exhausted every night." She smiled. "But she wrapped our presents with pride." Benjamin quietly folded his hands. "Because she'd earned them." "Exactly." A thoughtful silence settled between them. Benjamin found himself remembering Grace again. The conversations felt strangely familiar, not because Cheryl repeated Grace's words, because she had reached the same conclusions through her own life. Benjamin walked toward a bookshelf. He picked up a framed photograph. It showed a smiling woman standing beside an old supermarket checkout lane. "My wife." Cheryl accepted the frame carefully. "She has kind eyes." "She did." Benjamin smiled. "Grace worked as a grocery cashier when we first met." He paused. "There was a day she came home in tears." Cheryl looked up. She'd been humiliated because she couldn't afford everything she needed. Something inside Cheryl shifted. The image of Register 6 flashed through her mind. Emma quietly returning the strawberries, customers whispering behind them. Benjamin continued softly. "She never forgot how invisible she felt." "Neither did I." Cheryl lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry she experienced that." "So am I." He took the photograph back gently. "She taught me something I'll spend the rest of my life trying to honor." "What was that?" Benjamin smiled. Kindness should never make noise. The sentence stirred something inside Cheryl. She couldn't explain why. It simply felt true. Neither of them noticed how naturally the conversation had drifted away from business. For nearly an hour, they spoke about neighborhoods, schools, food insecurity, children, and dignity. Not once did Benjamin mention quarterly earnings. Not once did Cheryl mention promotions or salary. When the meeting ended, Benjamin walked her to the door. "I'm looking forward to working with you." "So am I." As Cheryl disappeared down the hallway, Benjamin remained standing quietly. She still hadn't recognized him as the man who had stood silently beside Register 6. He had no intention of telling her. Not yet, because he wanted her to succeed, without ever feeling that she owed her place to one generous stranger on a Friday night. If she was going to build something meaningful here, it had to belong entirely to her. And deep inside, Benjamin suspected the hardest challenges were still waiting for both of them. During Cheryl Murphy's first month with the Carter Community Initiative, she learned something no orientation manual had prepared her for. Helping people was complicated. Helping people inside a large corporation was even more complicated. Every Monday morning, representatives from logistics, finance operations, and marketing gathered in the same conference room to review the pilot program. At first, everyone spoke enthusiastically. Reducing food waste sounded good. Supporting local communities sounded even better. But once conversations shifted from ideas to budgets, enthusiasm often gave way to hesitation. Every new delivery route carried a cost. Every additional refrigerated truck required funding. Every extra employee needed approval. The numbers filled spreadsheets. The people behind those numbers slowly disappeared. One Tuesday morning, Cheryl presented the latest progress report. She stood beside a screen, displaying maps of Columbus and several surrounding neighborhoods. "Our warehouse partners have identified more than 12,000 pounds of fresh produce each week that could reach families before expiration." Several executives nodded. Cheryl clicked to the next slide. "By adjusting delivery schedules instead of adding new routes, we can reduce transportation costs by nearly 18%. A vice president raised his hand. "What happens if demand increases?" "We'll scale gradually." Another executive asked, "What about staffing?" "We'll cross-train existing teams before hiring." The discussion remained productive until Michael Reynolds leaned forward in his chair. He folded his hands deliberately. "I have a different concern." The room grew quieter. Michael looked directly at Cheryl. "Your proposal relies heavily on community relationships." "Yes. Relationships don't appear on quarterly reports," Cheryl answered calmly. "No. They're difficult to measure." "They are." Michael nodded. "Then why should investors care?" Several people shifted uncomfortably. Cheryl paused before answering. "Because customers care." Michael smiled politely. "That's an emotional answer." "It's also a practical one." She stepped toward the screen. "When families trust a neighborhood grocery store, they return." She changed the slide. "When employees feel proud of where they work, turnover decreases." Another slide. "When fresh food reaches communities instead of landfills, disposal costs fall." She looked around the room. "Compassion and efficiency don't compete with each other." Silence followed. Michael remained unconvinced. "I still believe we're trying to solve too many social problems." Cheryl didn't react defensively. "I understand. We're a grocery company." "We are. We're not a charity." "No." She smiled gently. "We're a grocery company that serves communities." Michael leaned back. "There's a difference." "There is." She nodded. "And that's exactly why this program matters." The meeting ended without a decision. As executives gathered their laptops, Cheryl quietly collected her notes. She wasn't discouraged. She had expected resistance. Change rarely arrived without questions. Outside the conference room, Linda caught up with her. "You handled that well. I don't know if I changed anyone's mind." Linda smiled. "You weren't trying to win an argument." "No. You were trying to explain a purpose." They walked together towards the elevators. Linda glanced sideways. Benjamin was listening very carefully. Cheryl looked surprised. "He didn't say much." Linda laughed softly. "When Benjamin speaks less, he's usually thinking more." Meanwhile, Benjamin remained alone in the conference room after everyone else had left. He looked again at Cheryl's presentation. Most executives had focused on projected expenses. Benjamin found himself reading the handwritten notes she'd added in the margins. One sentence stood out. "Families remember respect longer than discounts." He smiled faintly. Grace would have underlined that sentence. Later that afternoon, Benjamin invited Michael Reynolds into his office. Michael entered carrying several financial reports. "I assume you want updated projections." Benjamin motioned toward the chair. "Sit." Michael complied. Benjamin looked out the window before speaking. "Tell me honestly." Michael waited. "What worries you about Cheryl's project?" Michael appreciated the directness. "I don't question her intentions. But I question sustainability." Benjamin nodded. "Go on." "We're introducing processes that don't immediately maximize profit." Benjamin turned toward him. "What does maximize profit mean?" Michael looked puzzled. "The highest financial return." "Over what period?" Michael hesitated. "This quarter." Benjamin smiled gently. "And next decade?" Michael remained silent. Benjamin walked to a bookshelf and removed a worn leather notebook. "I started Carter Foods with one neighborhood store." He placed the notebook on his desk. "My first business plan fit on 8 handwritten pages." Michael listened quietly. Benjamin opened to the final page. Across the bottom in Grace's handwriting were 6 simple words. "Treat every customer like a neighbor." Benjamin looked at Michael. "We didn't grow because we sold cheaper groceries." He paused. "We grew because people trusted us." Michael studied the faded handwriting. "I understand the principle." "Do you?" Benjamin asked kindly. "Because trust isn't built during easy transactions." He closed the notebook. "It's built during difficult ones." Michael lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Benjamin wasn't criticizing him. He was reminding him. There was a difference. That same evening, Cheryl stayed late reviewing delivery schedules. The office had become almost silent. Most employees had already gone home. As she organized shipment maps, she noticed Daniel Perez standing awkwardly outside her office door. She smiled. "Daniel." He stepped inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." Daniel held a folder against his chest. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "You convinced me to apply." "Apply?" "For the new community outreach positions." Cheryl looked genuinely pleased. "You did?" "I almost talked myself out of it." She laughed softly. "I know the feeling." Daniel smiled. "I kept thinking I wasn't qualified." "And now?" "I still think that." They both laughed. Daniel became more serious. "I just wanted you to know." He paused. "Seeing the way you carry yourself changed something for me." Cheryl looked surprised. "I don't think I've done anything special." "You have." Daniel shook his head. "You make people believe they belong." After he left, Cheryl sat quietly for several minutes. She thought about Emma, about Harold, about the stranger who had paid for groceries weeks earlier. None of them had tried to change her life with grand speeches. They had simply believed in her before she fully believed in herself. She closed her laptop and looked through the office window toward the parking lot below. Rows of shopping carts stood neatly together beneath the evening lights. Without realizing it, she smiled. The cart had once represented everything she couldn't afford. Now it reminded her of something entirely different. Sometimes the heaviest thing a person carried wasn't groceries. It was the fear that they didn't matter. And perhaps she thought, as she turned off the office lights, the real purpose of her work wasn't merely moving food from one place to another. It was helping people set down that invisible weight. The approval came on a Thursday morning. Not with applause, not with a company-wide announcement. Just a single email from Benjamin Carter's office. Pilot program approved. Implementation begins immediately. Cheryl read the message twice before allowing herself to believe it. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Weeks of planning, dozens of meetings, countless revisions. Every late evening spent adjusting delivery routes and calculating storage capacity had led to 12 simple words. She whispered to herself, "Now the real work begins." Within an hour, the conference room that had once been filled with debate transformed into a planning center. Maps covered one wall. Colored strings connected grocery stores to churches, schools, senior centers, and neighborhood kitchens. Whiteboards listed truck schedules, refrigeration capacities, volunteer organizations, and warehouse contacts. The room looked less like a corporate office and more like a community trying to solve a puzzle together. Linda Foster entered carrying a stack of personnel files. "We'll need a small operations team." Cheryl nodded. "People who understand logistics. And people who understand people." Linda smiled. Exactly. The company had given Cheryl one responsibility she hadn't expected. She could help select the first employees assigned to the program. The decision felt heavier than any spreadsheet. She remembered every interview she had ever attended, every employer who looked only at resumes, every opportunity she never received because someone assumed experience mattered more than character. She promised herself she wouldn't make the same mistake. Over the next week, applicants filled the interview schedule. Some arrived wearing expensive suits. Others came directly from work in warehouse uniforms or delivery jackets. Cheryl asked every candidate the same final question. "Tell me about a time someone trusted you before you believed in yourself." The answers revealed far more than resumes ever could. One applicant spoke for 10 minutes without mentioning another person. Another described awards and promotions. A third admitted he couldn't think of anything. Then Daniel Perez walked into the room. He looked nervous, despite wearing a neatly pressed shirt and tie. Cheryl smiled warmly. "It's good to see you again." "You too." The interview began with routine questions: customer service, inventory systems, conflict resolution, Daniel answered honestly. When Cheryl asked the final question, he became quiet. Finally, he spoke. "I used to think I was just a cashier." She listened. "The night you came through my checkout lane?" He stopped for a second. "I wanted to do more." "You already did." Daniel shook his head. "I followed instructions." He looked down briefly. "But after you came back the next morning to leave $20 for someone else." His voice softened. "I realized kindness can spread faster than fear." Cheryl smiled. "What changed?" "I stopped waiting for permission to care." The room fell silent. After Daniel left, Linda looked at Cheryl. "What do you think?" "I think he understands why this program exists." "He doesn't have management experience." "No. But he has something harder to teach." Linda smiled knowingly. "Empathy." Daniel received the position. A few days later, another familiar name appeared during hiring discussions. Olivia Grant, the same store manager from the night Cheryl had been humiliated. She had submitted a request to transfer into community operations. Several committee members immediately objected. "Her customer service record has complaints." She created unnecessary conflict. I don't think she'd fit this culture. Cheryl quietly read Olivia's application. Attached was a handwritten letter. It wasn't polished. There were crossed-out sentences and uneven handwriting. One paragraph caught Cheryl's attention. I've spent years measuring success by speed and numbers. The night I embarrassed a mother who was trying her best, I went home believing I'd simply enforced company policy. I didn't realize until much later that I had forgotten the human being standing in front of me. If people can change, I'd like the opportunity to prove I can. The room waited for Cheryl's opinion. She placed the letter on the table. I'd like to interview her. Several people looked surprised. During the interview, Olivia didn't defend herself. She didn't blame pressure from headquarters. She didn't mention staffing shortages. Instead, she said something unexpected. I replay that night more often than I'd like to admit. Cheryl remained silent. I keep wondering, Olivia swallowed, what Emma must have been thinking while I hurried her mother. Cheryl answered honestly. She was thinking about strawberries. Olivia lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. The apology wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It sounded painfully genuine. After the interview, Linda asked, Can you work with her? Cheryl looked through the conference room window. People trusted me when I needed a chance. She turned back. I'd like to do the same. Olivia joined the pilot program. When she learned Cheryl had supported her application, she stood speechless for several seconds. You didn't have to. I know. After everything, Cheryl smiled gently. If this program is about second chances, we should probably believe in them. Those words stayed with Olivia. As the team grew, the atmosphere began to change. Warehouse employees suggested new ideas without fear. Cashiers reported surplus food before it spoiled. Store managers coordinated directly with community kitchens instead of waiting for instructions. Every small improvement connected to another. Benjamin watched quietly from a distance. He attended planning meetings but rarely interrupted. He preferred listening. One afternoon, he walked through the operations center where Cheryl and her team were preparing the first week's distribution schedule. Daniel was reviewing delivery times. Olivia was calling neighborhood churches to confirm refrigeration space. Linda was updating partnership agreements. Cheryl moved from one conversation to another, answering questions, solving problems, encouraging hesitant employees. She never raised her voice. She never hurried anyone unnecessarily, yet work continued smoothly. Benjamin stopped beside Linda. Notice anything? She smiled. Everyone's talking to each other. Exactly. He looked around the room. No one's trying to protect their department. They're protecting the mission. Benjamin nodded. Grace had once told him that real leadership wasn't measured by how many people followed one person. It was measured by how many people began helping one another without being asked. Looking around the room, he realized that was exactly what Cheryl had created. Not through authority, not through fear, not even through experience. She had built it through trust. And trust, Benjamin knew, was always the strongest foundation any community or any company could ever have. By early autumn, the pilot program had been operating for just over 6 months. What had started as a modest experiment connecting 5 Carter food stores with a handful of neighborhood organizations had quietly expanded across Columbus. No one inside the company had expected the numbers. Food waste from participating stores had fallen by nearly 38%. Transportation costs had dropped instead of rising. Employee turnover in the pilot locations was the lowest in the region. But the figures that meant the most to Cheryl couldn't be found in any spreadsheet. Every Tuesday afternoon, she visited one of the community partners instead of staying behind a desk. She believed reports explained results. Conversations explained people. One rainy afternoon, Cheryl stopped by the East Haven Community Kitchen, where volunteers were preparing dinner for nearly 200 families. Boxes of fresh tomatoes, Lettuce, apples, yogurt, and whole grain bread lined the walls. Only a year earlier, most of those foods would have been discarded before anyone had the chance to enjoy them. Now they were becoming warm meals. Pastor Samuel Reed greeted Cheryl with a broad smile. "You've got to see this." He led her toward the dining hall. Children laughed around long tables while parents chatted over bowls of homemade vegetable soup. No one rushed. No one stood in line clutching plastic bags. The room felt less like a charity and more like a neighborhood dinner. Pastor Reed lowered his voice. "Do you remember Mrs. Alvarez?" Cheryl searched her memory. "The grandmother raising 2 boys?" He nodded. "She started volunteering 3 weeks after receiving food deliveries. And now? Now she coordinates our evening pantry." Cheryl smiled. "That's wonderful. It keeps happening." Pastor Reed pointed discreetly across the room. "The young father serving bread." Cheryl nodded. "He was one of the first families your program helped." She watched the man laugh as a little girl asked for another slice. "He comes every Saturday now." Not because he needed food, because he wanted to help prepare it. Driving back to headquarters, Cheryl thought about Emma's drawing of hearts floating above a grocery cart. Perhaps kindness really did travel farther than anyone expected. The following Monday, Carter Foods hosted its quarterly leadership meeting. Executives from every region filled the large auditorium. Charts covered the giant projection screens: revenue, growth, operating costs. Then came the final presentation. Linda introduced Cheryl to the stage. As applause faded, Cheryl stood behind the podium for a moment before speaking. "I could spend the next 20 minutes discussing percentages." A few executives smiled. "They matter." She clicked to the first slide. Instead of graphs, a photograph appeared. It showed a school cafeteria where children were choosing fresh fruit from colorful baskets. "This is Lincoln Elementary." Another photograph. A senior center. Another. A neighborhood kitchen. Another. Store employees unloading fresh vegetables while local volunteers greeted them by name. "The success of this program isn't that we moved food." She paused. "It's that we built relationships strong enough to keep moving it." The room grew quiet. She explained how store employees had begun suggesting improvements without being asked, how warehouse workers took pride in reducing waste, how community organizations now planned menus around reliable deliveries instead of unpredictable donations. Then she reached her final slide. It showed a simple shopping cart. Nothing inside it, just the cart. Several executives looked puzzled. Cheryl smiled. "I used to think grocery carts measured what families could afford." She looked across the audience. "Now I believe they measure something else." No one spoke. "They measure whether people feel welcome enough to fill them." Silence lingered for several seconds before applause slowly spread through the auditorium. Benjamin remained seated. He didn't clap immediately. Instead, he watched the employees. Many weren't applauding because they had been instructed to. They were applauding because they recognized their own work inside Cheryl's words. When he finally joined them, his applause was quiet but heartfelt. After the meeting, Michael Reynolds approached Cheryl near the lobby. She wasn't expecting it. "I owe you an apology." She looked surprised. "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Michael smiled awkwardly. "I spent months trying to prove this program wouldn't work." He glanced toward the auditorium. "I was wrong." Cheryl answered gently. "We were solving different problems." Michael nodded. "I was looking at quarterly reports. And I was looking at neighborhoods." He laughed softly. "I've started visiting them too." She smiled. "What do you think?" "I think spreadsheets leave out important people." For Cheryl, that admission meant more than winning an argument ever could. A week later, another unexpected visitor arrived at headquarters. Harold Simmons walked into Cheryl's office carrying a cardboard box. "I've got something." "What is it?" He opened the box. Inside were dozens of handwritten suggestion cards collected from warehouse employees. "What's this?" "They asked me to give these to you." Cheryl picked up the first card. "Thank you for proving warehouse workers can change more than inventory." The next. "My daughter eats fresh fruit because of this program." Another. "I've never been prouder to wear this company logo." One after another, the messages filled the room with quiet gratitude. Cheryl blinked back tears. Harold smiled. "You always thought you were organizing shipments." He nodded toward the box. "You've been organizing hope." That evening, before heading home, Cheryl stopped by Carter Foods on East Hamilton Avenue. The same store, the same entrance, the same automatic doors. Customers moved through the aisles just as they had months earlier. Daniel now supervised several checkout lanes. Olivia greeted customers personally near the entrance. An elderly man struggled to reach a package from the top shelf. Before anyone called for assistance, Olivia walked over and helped him with a warm smile. As Cheryl watched a young cashier quietly honored an expired sale price without making the customer feel embarrassed. "No problem," the cashier said kindly. "We'll take care of it." The customer smiled with visible relief. Cheryl stood silently for a moment. The store looked the same, but somehow it felt entirely different. Kindness, she realized, had become part of the building itself. She smiled as she left, unaware that across the parking lot, Benjamin Carter had been watching from inside his old pickup truck. He didn't follow her. He simply sat there with the engine off, looking at the entrance where one ordinary act of compassion had quietly transformed far more lives than either of them could have imagined. The invitation arrived without explanation. Linda Foster stopped by Cheryl's office just before lunch carrying a cream-colored envelope. "Benjamin would like to meet with you this afternoon." Cheryl looked up from a stack of distribution reports. "Is everything all right?" Linda smiled. "Everything is more than all right." "Then why do I suddenly feel nervous?" "Because important conversations usually begin that way." At 3 o'clock sharp, Cheryl knocked gently on Benjamin Carter's office door. "Come in." The office looked much as it had during their first meeting. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Columbus. Bookshelves lined one wall. A framed photograph of Grace still rested on the corner of his desk. Benjamin stood beside the window holding 2 mugs of coffee. "I remembered you take yours with just a little cream." Cheryl accepted the mug with a grateful smile. "You remembered." "I try to remember things that matter." For a few minutes, they talked about ordinary subjects. The latest community partnerships, a school pantry opening on the west side of the city, a refrigerated truck that had finally been repaired after weeks of delays. Then Benjamin became unusually quiet. He walked to a wooden cabinet behind his desk and unlocked the top drawer. From inside, he removed a simple manila folder. He placed it carefully on the desk between them. "I've been waiting a long time to show you this." Cheryl looked at the folder, but didn't reach for it. "What is it?" "Open it." She slid the papers from inside. At first, she didn't understand what she was looking at. Then she froze. It was a grocery receipt. The date, the store location, the total, the discounted items, the strawberries, every detail returned in an instant. She looked at the bottom of the receipt where another line had been added. "Paid in full." Her fingers trembled. "This is..." Benjamin nodded gently. "The receipt from that Friday night." Cheryl stared at it without speaking. She could almost hear the register beeping again. She could see Emma placing the strawberries back on the conveyor belt. She could hear the impatient voices behind her. For months, she had wondered about the stranger who had disappeared before she could say thank you. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she lifted her eyes toward Benjamin. "It was you." Benjamin didn't answer immediately. Finally, he nodded. Yes. The room fell silent. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind that arrives when two people realize they have unknowingly shared the same story from opposite sides. Cheryl swallowed hard. I've imagined that moment so many times. She smiled faintly through gathering tears. I thought maybe it was a pastor. She laughed softly. Or a retired teacher. Benjamin smiled. I've been mistaken for worse. She shook her head. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want your future to belong to my generosity. She looked at him confused. Benjamin leaned forward. If I had introduced myself that night, he paused. Every success afterward would have felt connected to a favor. He folded his hands. I never wanted that. Cheryl lowered her eyes to the receipt again. So every opportunity you earned. The interviews? You earned. The promotion you earned. The trust. Benjamin smiled warmly. You earned every bit of it. A tear finally slipped down Cheryl's cheek. She wiped it away quickly. I spent weeks trying to figure out how to thank the person who paid for our groceries. Benjamin shook his head. You already did. She looked puzzled. When? The next morning. He smiled. When you came back and left $20 for the next family. Cheryl stared at him. You knew about that? I watched. Another long silence settled over the office. Benjamin stood and walked toward the window. When Grace came home crying all those years ago. He spoke quietly, almost as though he were talking to himself. I promised that if I ever had the chance, I'd build stores where people never had to choose between food and dignity. He turned back toward Cheryl. I've spent decades trying. And then I met you. Cheryl listened without interrupting. You taught me something I hadn't fully understood. Benjamin's voice softened. Kindness doesn't end when someone receives it. He looked directly into her eyes. It begins. Cheryl felt her throat tightens. I didn't do anything extraordinary. You did. Benjamin shook his head gently. You refused to let generosity stop with you. He pointed toward the framed reports displayed on the wall. Those community kitchens. The school partnerships. The employees you've inspired. The family's eating fresh food tonight. He smiled. None of that happened because I paid $27.43. He paused. It happened because of the choices you made afterward. The words settled deeply inside Cheryl. For months she had quietly carried a feeling that she somehow owed Benjamin for everything that had happened. Now that burden slowly disappeared. Not because she was ungrateful, because he had never wanted gratitude to become a debt. Benjamin reached into the same folder once more. This time he removed a small photograph. It showed Grace standing beside an old grocery checkout lane, laughing at something outside the frame. He handed it to Cheryl. This was taken a few weeks before we opened our first store. Cheryl smiled. She looks happy. She was. Benjamin's eyes softened. She believed every person deserved to leave a grocery store feeling respected. He chuckled quietly. She would probably tell me I've been talking too much today. Both of them laughed. After a moment, Cheryl looked again at the receipt. I kept thinking that night was about the groceries. Benjamin smiled. It never was. She looked up. It was about being seen. Benjamin nodded slowly. Exactly. Before Cheryl left, Benjamin walked with her to the office door. She turned back one last time. I still don't know how to thank you. He smiled with the same quiet warmth she remembered from that forgotten Friday night, though she hadn't known his face then. If you really want to thank me, she waited. Keep doing what you've already been doing. He glanced toward the busy offices beyond the hallway. Make sure the next person who feels invisible isn't. Cheryl nodded. I promise. As the elevator doors closed behind her, she looked once more at the faded grocery receipt still resting in her hands. For the first time, it no longer reminded her of $27.43. It reminded her of the moment one quiet act of kindness had refused to end with a single checkout lane, and had instead become the beginning of 1,000 new stories. 1 year later, the East Hamilton Avenue Carter Foods looked almost exactly as it had on the night Cheryl Murphy's life quietly changed. The automatic doors still opened with the same soft whoosh. Children still asked for cookies from the bakery. Employees still hurried through busy Friday evenings with shopping carts weaving between checkout lanes. To most customers, nothing seemed different. But the people who worked there knew better. Near the front entrance stood something that had never existed before. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't surrounded by banners or television cameras. It was simply a clean grocery cart painted deep blue. A small wooden sign hung from the handle. If you take what you need today, leave hope for someone tomorrow. Inside the cart sat fresh produce bread, baby formula diapers, canned soup cereal, and handwritten envelopes containing grocery gift cards donated anonymously by customers who wanted to help neighbors they would probably never meet. No names, no recognition, only quiet generosity. The employees called it the Hope Cart. Customers loved it because it never made anyone feel like a charity case. If a family came up the few dollars short at the register, the cashier could simply point to the cart. If a single father needed diapers before payday, he could take a package without filling out forms. If an elderly woman hesitated over medicine or fresh fruit, someone would quietly add a gift card to her receipt without announcing where it came from. The Hope Cart had become exactly what Grace Carter had once dreamed a grocery store could be. A place where kindness never needed permission. On a crisp October evening, Cheryl walked through the store holding Emma's hand. Emma was now 9 years old. She had grown taller, her asthma had improved, and tucked beneath her arm was the same sketchbook she carried almost everywhere. Daniel Perez, now the store's community operations supervisor, greeted them with a wide smile. Look who finally decided to visit. Emma laughed. We've been busy. I heard. Daniel looked toward Cheryl. The new school pantry is already getting amazing feedback. We've still got a lot to learn. Daniel shook his head. You still say that. Because it's true. As they talked, movement near Register 4 caught Cheryl's attention. A young mother stood at the checkout with a little boy no older than 5. The register displayed an unpaid balance. The woman searched desperately through her purse. Coins, a crumpled dollar bill, receipts. Nothing more. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I thought I had enough. Her little boy quietly held a box of whole-grain cereal against his chest. I don't need it, Mom. The sentence froze Cheryl where she stood. For one brief moment, time folded back on itself. She no longer saw the young mother. She saw herself. She saw Emma carefully placing strawberries back on the conveyor belt. She heard impatient sighs. She remembered feeling as though the entire store had become impossibly quiet. Without saying a word, Cheryl walked toward Daniel. She reached into her purse. Inside was a plain white envelope containing $30 in cash. She handed it to him discreetly. Please. Daniel looked at the envelope, then at Cheryl. A slow smile appeared. You don't want her to know? Cheryl shook her head. No. Daniel nodded. I understand. He walked to the register and quietly spoke with the cashier. Moments later, the cashier smiled warmly at the young mother. Everything's taken care of. The woman's eyes filled with tears. There must be a mistake. No mistake. Who? The cashier simply smiled. Someone wanted your family to enjoy dinner tonight. The young mother looked around the store, hoping to find the stranger. She never did. Cheryl and Emma had already stepped quietly into another aisle. Emma looked up at her mother. "You did it." Cheryl squeezed her hand. "So did someone else." Emma smiled knowingly. "The circle keeps going." "It does." Before leaving, Emma walked over to the Hope cart. She carefully removed something from her sketchbook, a drawing. It showed a grocery cart overflowing with fruit bread flowers and smiling families. Above it, in careful handwriting, she had written, "Kindness always comes back pushing another cart." She placed the drawing inside a simple wooden frame that Daniel had left beside the cart for children's artwork. Several nearby customers stopped to admire it. One elderly gentleman quietly wiped his eyes. Across the parking lot, Benjamin Carter sat inside the same aging pickup truck he had driven for years. He had come only to observe, just as he always had. Through the windshield, he watched Cheryl and Emma leave the store, carrying 2 modest grocery bags. Nothing about them suggested headlines or extraordinary success. They looked like what they had always been: a mother, a daughter, 2 ordinary people walking toward an old blue sedan. Benjamin smiled. Grace had been right all along. Kindness didn't need to make noise. It only needed someone willing to begin. He reached into the glove compartment and unfolded the faded grocery receipt he had kept all this time. $27.43. The ink had started to fade. The paper had softened with age. Yet to Benjamin it remained the most valuable receipt he had ever kept. Not because of what it had purchased, because of what it had started. As Cheryl started the engine, Emma looked out the window and noticed Benjamin's pickup parked in the distance. She waved enthusiastically. Benjamin smiled and waved back. She didn't know why the older man seemed familiar. She simply felt that he deserved a friendly goodbye. Benjamin waited until their blue sedan disappeared into the evening traffic before starting his own truck. The parking lot slowly emptied. Employees gathered abandoned shopping carts. The Hope cart remained near the entrance, waiting quietly for the next family who might need it, waiting for the next opportunity to remind someone that dignity and kindness could exist in the same place, waiting for another ordinary person to discover that the smallest act of compassion could become the beginning of a story far greater than anyone imagined. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't that someone rescues us when we fall. It's that they help us stand without making us feel small. True kindness protects a person's dignity. It doesn't ask for applause, repayment, or recognition. It simply opens a door and trusts that the person walking through it will one day open another door for someone else. Cheryl never became extraordinary because a billionaire paid for her groceries. She became extraordinary because she refused to let one act of kindness end with her. Benjamin didn't change the world by spending $27.43. He changed it by believing that character deserved opportunity and by stepping back so someone else could shine. Every one of us has the chance to become part of that same circle. Sometimes we are the person who needs help. Sometimes we are the person who notices. And sometimes we are the quiet stranger who reminds another human being that they are seen valued and never alone. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. Have you ever experienced a small act of kindness that changed your life? Share your story in the comments so others can be encouraged by it. If you enjoyed this journey, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how powerful compassion can be.